Hello and welcome to this edition of Assembly Calendar. I'm Ed Vischer. Our guest today is New York State Assemblyman Tom McKevitt, who represents the 17th Assembly District of Nassau County. Thank you very much for joining us today. Always a pleasure to see you folks at home, and always nice to see the Assemblyman. This is his first show since the wrap-up, the end of the 2015 legislative session, and we're going to talk to him about some of the highs and lows of the session and his overall thoughts on it, and then kind of break it down to some very specific pieces of legislation and get his overall thoughts on those as well. Always nice to see you, sir.
It was great to be here, Matt.
Welcome back to Albany.
Yes,
I
guess.
Hot August day.
That's right.
And this is the first time we've been sitting down with you since the close of session, and just your overall thoughts on how it went.
First of all, it's my 10th session, and by far the most unusual one I've ever seen. It started with the indictment of the Assembly Speaker. Midway through, we went to the indictment of the Senate Majority Leader. So we had both no leaders on both sides, which made for a very unsettling situation. At the end of the day, we got the work done. Session went about 2 weeks longer than it should have been because they were trying to wrap all the issues of rent control at the end of the days. But again, I say once again, I think another disappointing session in the sense of lost opportunity. We did go and renew the tax cap, which is one thing that a lot of residents go and do ask for in order to try to make the tax burden a little bit easier as far as concerned. But once again, for our local governments, no mandate relief. Governor's promising it now for 5 years. We still have yet to have it. And again, I think there's a lot of things we could have done structurally to help reform New York State government, our local governments, and once again, we failed to do so.
And you talk about those unfunded mandates. Those are the drivers, if you will, of property taxes.
Right, and when we had this discussion with the governor going back again 4 or 5 years ago about the fact that we need to go and have mandate relief, his answer was, well, the tax cap will then draw and will force the mandate relief. Well, again, we're waiting. He impaneled a task force back in 2011 to do this. I'm not sure. Maybe they met once or so, and it was just pretty much disappeared after that. And again, it's a big, big problem which still needs to be addressed, and there simply seems to be no leadership from him, at least, in conquering that issue.
And you talked about the leadership change, both in the Assembly and the Senate, with the stepping down of Speaker Sheldon Silver, and then the Majority Leader in the Senate, Dean Skello, stepping aside as well. Whenever you have a change in leadership at the top, you are always somewhat optimistic that you could see some changes trickle down, specifically as it relates to ethics reforms and some of the changes maybe to the rules of the House and how bills are brought to the floor. Talk to us about that. Well, there was a lack of significant change this year.
There's very much a lack of significant change. And I think the biggest shortcoming more than anything else is an issue which actually reported not too long ago is regarding the pension reform as far as it's concerned. Back in 2010, the Republican conference in the Assembly were the first ones to push the idea of changing the Constitution. Because the problem is the way the New York State Constitution is structured, that once you give a pension benefit, you can't take it away ever. So the only way you can change that is by amending the Constitution. And one thing we at least wanted to begin was by saying, listen, if you're a public official and you've used your job in order to go and get any ill-gotten gains, whether through corruption or bribery or anything like that, you shouldn't be rewarded. We once had a school superintendent who went and was part of a scheme which stole maybe $8, $10, $12 million from the school district, and while he was sitting in jail, was getting $150,000, $160,000 a year in pension waiting for him the day he walks out of jail. So these are significant concerns that we really felt needed to be addressed. And ironically, as the budget came down to at the end of the day, there was an agreement. There was an agreement between the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly to have a constitutional amendment in order to do it. The Senate passed it. The Assembly did not, for reasons which to this day still haven't not made clear to me. So then in the end of session in June, the Assembly then went and passed its own version of this, again, pension forfeiture, but it doesn't match the Senate's. So, again, we had an agreement back in March with the budget in order to make it happen. As we sit here today, there's still none, as we've simply had a couple more members, whether it be Senator Sampson, Senator Libous, continued to be arrested and convicted, and we certainly have a couple more at that point. There's still no pension forfeiture for those officials from the ill-gotten gains.
And you spoke about that on the floor of the State Assembly in June, and we're going to go ahead and roll that, and we'll come back and discuss in further detail with Assemblyman Tom McKevitt.
Certainly when the budget was passed this past year on March 31st in the early hours of April 1st of this year, we contemplated doing a pension forfeiture bill to include all those in public office to go and forfeit their pensions if they're indeed convicted of some sort of crime that is related to their office. And I certainly do commend the sponsor who's been working on this issue for many years. And something he's been working to try to bring to this point. And again, he's done some very good bills, some excellent bills that I think some of us may agree more on this one. And again, I do want to commend him for going and bringing it to this step. My concern is that by drafting it with such specificity and by putting these terms in the Constitution could really be restraining us in carrying out what this intent is. And by putting these details in there, if something needs to be fixed or amended later on, instead of fixing it in a statute in a couple of weeks, we're now bringing it to possibly a 3-year-long constitutional amendment to go down that path. So certainly I do support the concept, but I think just perhaps the way we're going about it tonight is not going to go and serve the ends which we are truly looking to intend to do. Thank you.
And as you mentioned there, it was a watered-down version which never made it to passage at the close of session. What were the differences between the pension forfeiture that was going to be passed as part of the budget and this watered-down version?
The one that was part of the budget was actually a very simple constitutional amendment, which said that if you're, an official, a public employee, and you have, gotten some sort of conviction related to your jobs, then therefore you'd lose the gains of your pension at that point. The one that was eventually passed by the Assembly was a much more complex. It was actually many lines long, and it contained a number of things about certain officials and certain types of calculating things, stuff like that. And again, my point during the debate is that there's a lot of language that can be interpreted differently with that. And if you go and they wrote the constitutional amendment like a statute. And many times when the courts get involved, I mean, invariably, the first time this occurs, whoever is going to have their pension way is going to try to fight it. You may have judges who may interpret it differently than the way we were interpreting it. And at the end of the day, these officials may still have their pension. And by putting such long and detailed language in there, in order for us to fix that, there's sometimes when a judge may interpret something incorrectly, and we're able to, in a few weeks, fix it by having both houses pass a law and have the governor do it. The quickest you can get a constitutional amendment passed sometimes is 3 years, because it has to be passed by 2 successive legislatures. So, for example, if we have an idea to go and pass a constitutional amendment, we'd have to pass it in the 2016 legislature, which ends December 31st, 2016, then the next legislature in 2017, and then it would have to go to the voters for a referendum. So even at lightning speed, you're talking 2 years away. And in the meantime, the whole intent was going to take the pensions away from these officials who receive them and use their offices to commit these crimes. They'll still be able to go and obtain them at that point. So to me, it really defeats the whole purpose. Again, there was an agreement which was made in March. And I asked the sponsor, Mr. Buchwald, again, is a very nice gentleman, very upstanding. He's been from the very beginning trying to go make this an issue. And I asked him, why didn't we pass the version the Senate passed? And he couldn't give any explanation whatsoever why that was the case. So be it.
Very interesting. So we'll have to wait and see where that measure goes next year.
As of now, the Senate has one version. We have another version. And unless we fix something by this, by the following session of 2016, then we're going to be talking to 2019 at the earliest. So the longer it's delays, the longer this gets kicked down the road.
If I could draw you out a little bit on an issue that's more localized in terms of your district in Long Island specifically, and that was a proposal recently to close some hospitals in the area. Talk to us about that.
Well, what happened was in Brooklyn, there was a hospital called Long Island College Hospital, which essentially had run into just a serious financial situation, and the hospital was forced to close. Mayor de Blasio, when he was the New York City public advocate, was actually arrested trying to stop the hospital from closing. There were some lawsuits with it. At the end of the day, the hospital closed because there simply wasn't the money to sustain anymore. And there's a bill which was being introduced in the Assembly which would have made it much more difficult to close a hospital, and I can understand to one extent. My question is, what if there's no money around a hospital? If the money's there, how does it get paid for? And again, the majority was not able to simply answer that simple question for me.
And you spoke on that bill on the floor, and
Yes.
we'll come back and discuss in further detail with Assemblyman Tom McKevitt.
Certainly, we all represent communities where hospitals are a very important part of the community, and they serve a need which is by no means just a need that we not necessarily wish or is a nice thing to have. It's a necessity to go and provide health care to our communities. But as we know, in the challenging environment that many hospitals and health care providers operate in this day, some positions more difficult than others. And we've actually seen a number of problems about hospitals closing. We actually had the Burger Commission in the state, which forced hospitals to close in order to make sure that the entire system kept on operating to ensure that there was health care provided throughout parts of the state. And again, it's a sad day when a hospital closed, but sometimes, due to the complexities of finance, that's the only way it comes about. I certainly understand where the sponsor comes from. They had a very difficult situation whereby you had a community which may have problems with its needs of the hospital closing. But my concern is the way this bill is written may, in fact, do more harm than good. The fact is that now it goes requires the commissioner to make that determination, and if the community's needs cannot be met, then the hospital does not close. That's how I'm reading the bill. And the fact is there are some situations whereby, again, the hospital does not have the money to operate. In the situation we had with Long Island College Hospital, we had a SUNY system, and SUNY had the money to be able to be operating whilst litigation occurred. That may have worked in that situation. It may not work in others. One other concern I have, too, is that in the other portion of this bill, whereby right now there must be a community forum, which is 30 days after the hospital is closed. This required 45 days after the application for closure is made, and requires a number of notifications to community members, but only operates within New York City and not the rest of the state, even though this is designed to be a statewide bill. So again, I do commend the intent of the sponsor, but I do another number of problems the way this bill is written and implemented, and I'll be voting negative and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
So you just added a few safeguards in that legislation, pretty much.
That's right.
So where's the future there with that bill? I mean, did it pass the Assembly, I'm assuming?
Did not pass the Senate.
Did not pass the Senate.
No,
so that's not going anywhere.
No, it's not.
I wanted to, if I could, while we have a few more minutes left, get your overall thoughts on the recent decision by the Wage Board to raise the minimum wage for fast food service workers to $15 an hour.
Certainly the discussion of increasing the minimum wage, certainly a discussion we should have. I think it's something we should have in the legislature and be part of that process. But at this point, the governor just appointed a wage board, which seemingly just rubber stamped a rush to judgment to $15 an hour. My concern is this is going to hurt people more than it's going to help. The first thing is already those in the fast food industry are looking to automate the industry as much as possible to save them those costs. So number one, you'll probably have less jobs. Number two is at any point you're going to wind up having increased consumer costs and increased inflation in that regard. And number three is you may wind up putting some places out of business. So the very people that this wage board decision was trying to help may wind up being very, very much hurt at the end of the day. And again, if you're going to talk about minimum wage increases, let's talk in a public debate, but not have the governor appoint a wage board and just say this is going to happen and have some very serious adverse consequences.
Interestingly enough, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, initially the goal was to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour in New York City for fast food service workers, but the wage board decided to just arbitrarily make that statewide.
Yes, they did. It goes in New York City faster than it does everywhere else, but by 2020, it goes to everyone else around the rest of the state. And again, there are portions, whether it's in Buffalo or Long Island, which, again, doesn't have the
And there's a cost of living, too, assessment as well, evaluation. I mean, in terms of the raising the minimum wage, I mean, if it's more expensive to live in New York City, it would tend to make sense to raise the minimum wage faster as opposed to other parts of the state.
Again, you can make arguments with that, but again, that should be part of the legislative deliberative process, not for a three-member board appointed by the governor. Yes, it does go to the labor commissioner for approval. That person is an at-will employee of the governor. So we see where this is coming down from. And again, to me, it's a point that could have a lot of negative consequences on those employees and the rest of the people in the state.
Always a pleasure to see you, Assemblyman. It was a quick 15 minutes, as always. If you'd like to reach out to the Assemblyman, you can do so. He's always available on Facebook. You can also contact him at his district office at 1975 Hempstead Turnpike. That's in East Meadow, New York, 11554. His phone number there at 516-228-4960. You can email him at mckevett@assembly.state.ny.us. Always a pleasure to see you folks at home. Thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Assembly Calendar. Until next time, take care.